Well, hello, hello. Lovely to have you here. Today I want to discuss one of the central concepts in Buddhist Dharma. It's a concept that I'm surprised I haven't done a video about yet. I've discussed it here and there in a number of different places, but haven't really discussed it in particular, and that is the sense bases, what are known as ayatanas in Pali. And so in this video, what I want to do first of all is to discuss what they are. What are the sense bases? And secondly, why are they important? What is their role in the Dharma? Why do we care, basically? So that's going to be the outline of today's video. So first, what are they? What are the sense bases? Well, they come in two kinds. There's the internal sense bases and the external sense bases. The internal sense bases are basically our sense organs. That is to say, the internal sense bases would be the eyes, ears, nose, tongue, that is for taste, body for touches or feelings, and importantly, the mind as well. The mind is considered a sense base. That's one way in which Buddhist psychology is different from, or I should say philosophical psychology is different from the philosophy you find in the West, where they're only considered to be 5 senses and the mind is not considered a sense. So that's the internal ones. Now what about the external sense bases? Well, the external sense bases are the things that our eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind respond to. So the eye responds to sights or forms. Forms is usually the technical term in Buddhism, at least that's the English translation of the technical term, which are external visual field, visual objects. Here, what we hear are sounds, tastes, smells, touches, and for the mind, the external sense base are what are called ideas. The actual technical term is dharmas. So this is one of many uses of the word dharma, is that it's the sense bases of the mind. That's the things that the mind sees or perceives. Now these various sense bases, internal and external, really aren't given any significant further analysis. This is all we should understand pre-scientific. We're not trying to get in early Buddhism, we're not trying to get some kind of scientific understanding of the eye and the ear and so on. This is simply a rough and ready kind of understanding of the sort of roots of perception, if you like, the roots of our experience. Although form itself, that is what we see with our eyes, is given some small additional analysis in terms of the elements. And I've done a number of videos on the elements, earth, air, fire, and water, and sometimes there are 6 elements, but we don't need to get into that. I've done videos on those. I'll leave a link to a playlist of those videos down below in the notes if you want to hear more about the elements. But otherwise, these sense bases are not really further described. Now, the philosophically minded among you will notice that there is a bit of unclarity here about the external sense bases. Are these things external to us that are out in the world, or are they simply phenomena? You know, the way that we see the world, but there isn't an external world out there. In early Buddhism, there's no answer to that question. The Buddha never discusses that distinction. The distinction between a real external world that is really independent of us, or the idea that there isn't a real external world and that these external sense bases are simply phenomena. I think that his Dharma does push in one direction. I'm not going to get into that in this video, but for the points of this video, there really isn't a distinction made in early Buddhism. Later Buddhism, we find a lot of different arguments and elaborations around these two possibilities. That things are actually, in some sense, independent of us, that we're seeing, that we're interacting with. That makes the most sense, for example, in terms of forms that we think of as independent of us. Perhaps sounds are independent. We even might think of tastes or smells as being something outside that comes in. It's less, maybe with touches as well. Touches are a representation of something outside of us. But with ideas, it's something, we don't really know how to make sense of ideas being separate from us. But anyway, these are things that really are not elaborated in the early doctrines, and we don't need to worry about them. Okay, so second, why is it important to analyze our experience this way? Why do we discuss these sense bases at all in early Buddhism and Buddhism in general? Well, I can come up with 3 answers to that question. 1 having to do with consciousness, 2 having to do with dependent origination, and 3 having to do with this idea of the all. And so what I want to do here is describe each of these important points in succession. To begin with, about consciousness. Now, consciousness is indeed a prime example of the way that the Buddha taught by analyzing our experience into types. So our experience isn't simply a blooming, buzzing confusion, as William James famously described it, but rather it's not simply a confusion. It can be analyzed into types. In particular, it can be analyzed into a visual type, an auditory type, a gustatory type, an olfactory type, and so on, into these, indeed, 6 different types. And indeed, critical to the Buddha's understanding of consciousness is that it was not unified, that consciousness came in different flavors. That distinguishes the Dharma that the Buddha taught from the pre-Buddhist idea we find in the early Upanishads, where consciousness is this kind of unitary, unified thing that stands behind all of our experience, that constitutes our self, our Atman, our permanent self, and the self that goes from life to life. For the Buddha, that's not the case. And one of the ways you can see that that's not the case for the Buddha is that consciousness is not unified, that it comes in different flavors. Indeed, these 6 different flavors. And the Buddha described an idea of what he called contact. And contact is said to occur when the internal and external basis come together with consciousness. So, for example, when we first, let's say, wake up in the morning and see the sunrise, the sunrise, that form, that form out there, wherever it is, if it's out there or in here, doesn't matter, that form makes contact with our eye, and when that contact is made with the eye consciousness as well, that's contact. The contact of these 3 things together is indeed productive of that consciousness, if you like. The consciousness sort of arises out of this contact. And then when the contact is broken, let's say we close our eyes, for example, then consciousness, that eye consciousness, decays and goes away. So if we think of all of our consciousness as being that way, ear consciousness arising with a sound, that contact, but when the contact is broken, then the ear consciousness fades. This shows that the consciousness is impermanent, that it arises due to causes and conditions, that it passes away when those causes and conditions no longer hold, in particular, when contact no longer holds. And so consciousness cannot be a permanent self, it cannot be the self with a capital S, because it is dependently arisen, which we'll get to in our next point. So the second reason why these 6 sense bases are important in Buddhist Dharma, it has to do with their role in this chain of dependent origination. Now, dependent origination is an enormous topic. I'm not going to be able to get into all of it in this video, and there's many, many ways to interpret that chain. Once again, in this video, I'm only going to give one particular interpretation. I don't mean to suggest that's the only one. I've done a video, indeed a number of videos, on aspects of the chain of dependent origination. I'll leave links to those down below in the notes. But roughly speaking, in the chain of dependent origination, we have a number of different features that depend upon each other, that in a sense produce each other. I'm going to be discussing this in a somewhat linear fashion as to time. Again, there are other interpretations. So we begin with what's called name and form, which is well, it's not the first link in the chain, but it's the first one I'll discuss here. Name and form is a way that we can understand to describe the living body. So when name and form is first produced, let's say in the mother's womb, out of name and form arises these 6 sense bases, the 6 internal sense bases. That is, the name and form, this growing body, produces the eyes, the ears, the nose, the tongue, and the mind. And over time they develop. Once they develop, out of them arises contact. That is to say, it's because they have these sense bases that they can make this kind of contact with the external sense bases that are out in the world. And again, each one of their sense organs is going to produce a different kind of contact. Their eyes will produce a contact with forms, with eye things. Their ears will produce contact with things that can be heard, so on. I think we understand that. And then this contact that we make with external things conditions feeling. So in other words, a feeling is not emotional feeling, but rather pleasant and painful feeling. So we make contact with external things in the world. We naturally find some of them pleasant and some of them unpleasant. And what arises from feeling? Well, from feeling arises craving and clinging. In particular, we crave the things that we find pleasant, that we've made contact with in the world. And then through that craving and clinging comes suffering, comes dukkha, comes all of this mass of problems, because of course we crave and cling things to remain that we find pleasant, and they don't. They pass away because all things change. And so it is through the sense bases, through their contact with things in the world, through that contact producing pleasure in us and pains in us, and through those pleasures and pains conditioning craving and clinging, that we suffer from dukkha, from suffering. So what happens is that we experience these external sense bases, these sights, sounds, tastes, touches, so on, smells, ideas. We experience them and we become attached to them. And then they change, they go away, and suffering follows. Which leads on to the third reason why these sense bases are so important in early Buddhist Dharma. That is their relation to what's known as the all. There's a famous statement from the Buddha. He says, "And what is the all? It's just the eye and sights, the ear and sounds, the nose and smells, the tongue and tastes, the body and touches, and the mind and thoughts. This is called the all. Mendicants, suppose someone was to say, 'I'll reject this all and describe another all.' They'd have no grounds for that, and they'd be stumped by questions. And in addition, they'd get frustrated. Why is that? Because they're out of their element." All that we know comes through these 6 sense bases. There's nothing else that we can know of or speak of. And indeed, moreover, as the Buddha says in his fire sermon, his 3rd sermon, all of these senses, all of these sense bases, internal and external, are, he says, burning with the fires of greed, hatred, and delusion. All things that we can see, hear, taste, or touch, or think about are impermanent. All of them are things we can become attached to. And for these reasons, they are all dukkha. As the Buddha says in the Dhammapada, all conditioned things are dukkha, sabbe sankhara dukkham. And if you want to hear more about what the Buddha said in his fire sermon, I did a video on that soon after our recent house fire, so it relates to my own experiences just a little bit before making the video. So I'll leave a link to that video up here on the screen if you haven't seen it or if you'd like to see it again. Thanks so much for watching, for commenting, for being who you are. And if you're getting something out of these videos, take a look at my Patreon page, which is linked down below, and see if you want to help support the channel and get something nice in return for it. So we'll catch you on the next one, and meanwhile, all of you, Be well.